Mr. President, a few years ago, Tom Brokaw wrote a brilliant and important book called The Greatest Generation. And he described our fathers and grandfathers and mothers and grandmothers and what they did for this country, coming through the searing fire of the Great Depression, fighting and winning World War II, and then rebuilding our economy in the 1950s. We owe that generation everything we have. That generation sacrificed, I want to repeat that word, sacrificed on our behalf. We are literally standing on their shoulders. We are driving on the highways that they built. We enjoy our freedoms because of their sacrifice in World War II and in Korea. If Tom Brokaw writes another book about us, I don't know what it will be called, but it won't have greatest in the title. Instead of a compliment, it would be more of an epithet. We are leaving our children a gigantic national debt, crumbling infrastructure, and a changing climate that threatens their well-being and their future opportunities in this country. I rise today to talk about one of those factors, and that is infrastructure. I had a great insight when I was the governor of Maine, because every year governors go to New York to go through a ceremony of genuflecting and kissing the ring of the rating agencies in order to try to get their states a good high bond rating so that we'll have a low interest rate on our loans. I was all prepared for my meeting with the rating agencies and had all kinds of data about how prudent Maine was, how low our debt level was, how we paid it off in 10 years, how low our debt level was per capita. And I was in the middle of this presentation when one of the rating agency officials stopped me and said, "Governor, just because you have low debt, if you're not fixing your infrastructure, that is debt. Just as if it's debt on the books, just as if it's dollars that you owe, because the infrastructure is eventually going to have to be fixed. And of course, when it's fixed, the later you do it, the more it's going to cost." That was an insight for me that, we have this sort of mental bookkeeping where we have the dollars that we owe, but we don't think about a bridge being fixed as a form of debt. And yet that's exactly what we have in this country. We are handing our children a gigantic debt on all fronts because we are unwilling to pay the bills. I had another exchange once with a fellow who was a clerk in a hardware store. This was in the early 2000s, and I said, "What do you think of the tax cuts we recently passed?" I was just making conversation. He said, "There haven't been any tax cuts." I said, "What are you talking about? There were all, you see in the news, there are all these tax cuts we just passed in Washington." He said, No, we haven't passed any tax cuts." I said, "Don't you watch the news?" He said, "Look, if you pass tax cuts when you're in a deficit situation, all you're doing is borrowing more money, and your kids are going to have to pay for it with interest, so you're merely shifting the taxes from us to them." I'd never thought about it that way before. Of course, he was exactly right. If you cut taxes and cut expenditures at the same time, okay, that's legitimate public policy. But if you cut taxes and borrow the difference, you're really just shifting the cost to the next generation. And that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing right now, today. And we're doing it on all fronts. We're doing it in our federal debt and deficit posture, and we're doing it in our infrastructure posture. This is going to cost all of us. The subject, which I neglected to clarify at the beginning, is the fact that the Highway Trust Fund goes broke in just a few months. In fact, in a few weeks. Funding from the federal government for highways, for infrastructure around the country will decline precipitously starting in August. And we're talking around here about a patch, about something that will get us through a few months, 2 or 3 months, maybe 8 months. But nobody's talking about really solving the problem. And everybody's talking about all of these convoluted ways to avoid the reality that we need to pay for what we do. We need to pay for our highways, for our roads, for our bridges. And right now, we're not doing it. This is going to really hurt Maine. The estimates are from our Department of Transportation, it's going to cut our highway funding in our state by 17%, almost 20%. And it's particularly going to hurt if we don't do something in the next month because we have a short construction season. If we lose our funding between August and October, we've effectively lost it for the next 8 or 9 months. It's going to impair projects that are ongoing, and it's going to essentially eliminate across the country new highway and infrastructure projects. By the way, if you're the head of the Department of Transportation, your funding's going to be cut. What are you going to do? You're going to maintain, not invest. And maintaining is the bare minimum, but it's not investing, because that's where investing is where we have our wherewithal to compete in a global economy. It's very revealing to me to compare our funding levels of our infrastructure maintenance and investment with other countries. That's a fair comparison. It sort of tells us how we're doing. It puts it in perspective. Right now, our infrastructure investment is about 2.6% of gross domestic product, 2.6% of GDP. In Europe, it's 5%, and in China, it's 8.5%. It's 3 times, more than 3 times the level in our principal future economic competitor. They're investing, and we're disinvesting, because the infrastructure is crumbling faster than we're fixing it. The joke in Maine this winter was the potholes were so bad that instead of filling them, we're going to lower the roads. That's a joke, but boy, it says something about the seriousness of this issue. And Maine is no different than any other state. In fact, I would argue we have some of the best roads in the country, particularly given the far-flung nature of our state. But this is going to hurt us. It's going to hurt every state in the country. And yet we're around here trying to avoid talking about paying for them. There are indirect and direct costs. Not fixing the highways is costing our drivers more than an increase in the gas tax. In terms of delay, in terms of maintenance of automobiles, in terms of bent wheels from potholes. I talked to some people from United Parcel Service, UPS. Their fleet nationwide, a 5-minute delay per vehicle, because of congestion, because of lack of infrastructure investment, a 5-minute delay per vehicle nationwide costs that company $100 million a year. 5 minutes a day. Multiply that by everybody in the country, and we're paying a high price. The point is, we're paying a high price, but it's hidden. We don't notice it. If we increase the gas tax, everybody's going to notice that. But that's called paying your bills. As a young man, I represented a client before the Maine legislature. It was an engineering firm that was owed a bill by the state of Maine, and for some reason it hadn't been taken care of. I ended up appearing before the Appropriations Committee. This was 40 years ago. But I remember distinctly going before the committee and saying, here's this bill, and it has to be paid. And the members of the committee, by the way, the senior members were all Republicans, looked at each other and said, we got to pay our bills. That's called governing. And right now, we're not paying our bills. And it seems to me that's what we have to do. And it's interesting, one interesting thing about the gas tax is, which by the way hasn't been increased since 1993, 21 years ago, it's fallen in value something like 35% because of inflation over that period. But the interesting thing about the gas tax is it's the only tax that isn't effectively indexed. And by that I mean the sales tax, which many states have, my state does, 5%. You say, well, that's fixed over time. It's not indexed. But it is, because the value of goods to which the sales tax applies goes up over time. On a $100 tire, the sales tax, 5%, $5. But 5 years from now, that tire is probably going to cost $110, so it's going to be, a higher revenue. Same thing with the income tax. It may be at a flat level, 22% or 15%, or in Maine, in 5 or 6%. But incomes go up, so revenues go up proportionally to the changes in the economy. The gas tax is a fixed number, 18.6 cents. That's what it's been since 1993. It doesn't change at all. Do you think, Mr. President, that the cost of building roads is the same today as it was in 1993, 21 years ago? The answer is no. Now, we have to grapple with this. To me, what bothers me about this is part of a pattern. And I started with Tom Brokaw and The Greatest Generation. And if you think of the legacy that greatest generation left us, because they were willing to make sacrifices on our behalf, and then you say, what is the legacy of our generation? And it's debt, and it's crumbling infrastructure, and it's the crippling of our ability to compete in a globalized economy. Shame on us. Now, I don't know exactly what the answer is. I don't know whether it's a gas tax, a mileage tax, a change of the tax to the wholesale level as opposed to the retail level. I don't know, but I do know that no matter what we do and no matter how much we try to avoid it, we're going to have to pay our bills. And to not pay our bills, we have to realize, is simply passing those bills to our kids. That's unethical. It's immoral. It's wrong. And it's not what our parents and grandparents did for us. I think we owe the same level of consideration, the same level of sacrifice, the same level of realism, the same level of paying our bills to our children and grandchildren that we have been the beneficiaries of. So I hope as this debate unfolds in the next several weeks, that we pay attention to the critical importance that infrastructure plays in the competitiveness of our society and in our future for our children. The greatest generation built the interstate highway system, and we can't even keep it maintained. That's inexcusable. It's inexcusable, Mr. President, and I'm sorry to be so preachy about this, but I think this is a really important issue, and I think it goes in some ways to the heart of our politics today, where we're trying to do things and accomplish things, but not pay for them. The point of my comments, though, is they are going to be paid for. It's just going to be somebody else, that is, our children and grandchildren, who are going to be paying that bill. I think we ought to stand up and pay the bills ourselves and maintain the infrastructure that this country needs to compete, and give the same opportunity to our children and grandchildren that we were given by the greatest generation. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.